Hello, thank you all for coming. I will begin with a few basic remarks, all of which have to do with the way these paintings have been made and how they are to be perceived. As you can see, the works here on display are made up of latex, bands of latex stacked one next to the other. As L'Oreal will elaborate later on, these bands have been prepared beforehand through a process that involves pouring latex paint in liquid state within box-like containers where the paint eventually solidifies into a block. This block is then slivered, and the slivers are glued onto a panel. And here's the first point I would like to make. Color is not applied on a receptive surface. Color is instead assembled. And it is assembled through a process of production that bears some resemblance to factory work. Now, this assemblage of color, this construction of color, would seem to be superseded at the moment when the viewer confronts the finished work. For then, what becomes central is the optical experience of how different colors come to blend into a wavy, impermanent, immaterial color field. So that these paintings involve a basic fundamental tension between the sensation of color on the one hand and the production of color on the other. Sensation being immaterial and production involving the physicality of color as an assembled block. The key point is that the process of production does not stay in the background as something that is only relevant to the making of the work, as just a means for the creation of painterly form. Because production comes forward when the viewer examines the work at close range and then is able to grasp all the incidents, the accidents, the breaks of the material. This is all the more so since these works present the structure or a structure similar to that of built objects, with one part stacked one next to the other, so that the paintings sometimes might appear as assembled objects, the units of which is assembled color. Once the viewer takes this into consideration, it would seem difficult to step back to the moment when the painting appeared as a wavy color field. The materiality of color and the opticality of color come together in sharpened contradiction, a contradiction that is sustained relentlessly throughout these paintings. Now, L'Oreal often remarks that for him, contradictions are like the bookends of an idea. And in this case, such an idea would be an idea of painting, a notion, a concept of painting. That is mostly what this conversation is going to revolve around. What idea of painting, and perhaps contemporary painting, can be extracted from the different contradictions one is bound to find in these works? And so, to examine that process of production that I argue that's key to the understanding of the works, L'Oreal is going to give you a quick walk through his process.
Yes, hi. So I'd like to start at the studio so that you can see the objects before they're made. To me, it's very important that they go through many transformations. They go from liquid paint, to a solid, layer, and then the next layer builds on top of it. And as the process goes, the painting grows in a way. It really grows inside the mold until it's a solid block. And then there's another transformation when it's cut and then the process is revealed. So in a way, they're very transparent in the way that they're made, but there's also, I think showing you a few images at the studio would also help to visualize how they come to be, the way they are. So they start, it's a rectangular mold that has some parts that have plastic so that I can remove them afterwards. And then, this is two of them when they were just starting. And it's a process that takes, many months to, to complete the block. Sometimes, and this is something that I'm exploring further, I would put paint on a piece of plastic, let it dry, then rip it out and cut it. And that same dry paint I'll start putting inside of the mold. So that work over there, it's, I did a lot of that. And here I'm thinking of the interruptions as a way of, the process is set up as a very rational thing. It's like, okay, primary colors, one layer per color. And then these moments, it really like sort of break that sort of rational thought and bring it into like the material world, and it really brings in something else. Here's just a view of the tables where I put the pieces to dry. And then once the boxes are full, I will crack up open the molds, set them up for cutting. And I had this machine custom built for cutting the material. And here's so it's almost medieval process, of like, it's a guy with a hoist, and then, car jacks to keep the material in place, and there's a spacer, and, it's a very simple process. Like, I don't think the works are, it's not a hard, it's essentially a process of sedimentation and layering, and then it's a reveal of that. It's just to actually produce them at a certain scale, then it requires, a different sort of equipment and preparation. And then, I have my tables where everything, gets laid out until I'm ready to produce each work. And then you can see the work behind here on the table as I was, finalizing the composition and the format for the stretchers and just finalizing the work. And then the work gets glued into the wood panel, and, I use sometimes pins to like keep it together. So yeah, I thought it was important to just give a quick walk through the process, because it's a way of like visualizing how these sort of undergo all those transformations, from two-dimensional to three-dimensional, from liquid to solid, from, there are all these like translations that happen in the work that I think are important. And then we wanted to talk about, I guess, start here.
I just wanted to add that that your studio has this whole setting of sort of a factory workshop, but at the same time, if you go in there and you store all these layers once they're cut into cabinets trays, which you pull out when you need to examine, study the behavior of color. So it's sort of, to me, it gave me the impression of being like in a library of color, and a strong relation. I found a strong relation between that sort of study over time of color with the archiving process, that somehow I thought it was quite important, because in the end, when you glue all these layers onto the panel, the work itself seems sort of an archive of events, of facts, interruptions, accidents, all of that you are processing. So it can be read as a record, like you may have it here. So that issue of recording the behavior of color, it seems to me that it comes to inform the very structure of the work, the very layering of different events. So I just wanted to add that. And then we are going to talk about one very interesting project that L'Oreal did in 2009 in a gallery that it is important to remark, as far as I know, is a gallery that promotes self-specific art. Is it not?
Yeah, it's an alternative space, mostly for site-specific projects. It's Miami's oldest alternative space. And so this was in their first location after they were there for 10 years. So, these walls had been painted different colors, and then they had to be repainted white. And then, people would make a mural, and then it would be repainted white. And a lot of times I was the one painting them white because I worked there for a few years while I was a student and, like right after. So at some point I noticed I was doing the same process at the studio where I was layering paint and then letting it dry and then layering it again. And here I was doing it as a job. So for me it was interesting, the separation of like artistic labor and like just regular paid labor. And to me this like just became really interesting if I could excavate this history in the same way that I excavate my paintings and show the process. So I proposed to remove all the paint from the walls and then slice it and show the cross-section in these pieces that, I mean, here they look very white, but if you get close, you see the plaster that, all the screws that were covered, you can see all the colors of every exhibition that was there. I mean, you could see people who painted the walls for their shows looking for their colors in the paintings. And then also the space, you could see all the holes that were, opening the space. I mean, you could see, it was also a way of like making this invisible process of like keeping the white cube space, making it completely visible and, and transparent. Even some of the, holes that were done for certain installations, I mean, you had this register of like everything that had happened in that space. So for me, it's a very important project as the way that I think about my work and, a lot of the things that I do.
Yeah, I would say that it is that intention of sort of debunking the idea of the gallery as a white box, a neutral background for the display of art. So rendering that background material, but with particularity that now all that physicality itself, the materiality of the site is brought into the pictures, into the paintings, and now the paintings sort of provide a record of that history, that set of cumulative traces. But on the other hand, I think it's quite important to remark on the fact that you are also using what one could call site-specific labor. It's labor that you are sort of bringing into the picture because you were working at the gallery. So it's the work or labor of all the people who install art, paint the walls, as you were doing that at that time. So it's a labor specific to this place. It's not only the place, the specificity of the place, the site, the gallery, but it's the labor that is being done there that you are bringing to the picture. So I thought that was sort of a twist of other versions of this type of site specificity or institutional critique, that kind of.
Well, it's also, I always think that good labor remains invisible, If you walk into a space and you notice the paint on the walls, then it's because it's badly painted, So good labor should be, in a way, it's invisible. So to me, it was interesting to sort of, just make that visible as this process, So here we go sort of back just a little bit. I was working on these while I was applying for the Locust show, so some things are, so this actually I made right before the Locust show. And at first, I was layering paint mostly as a, I was more interested in accumulations, you know, thinking of historical accumulations, you know, cultural accumulations, language, you know, I mean, if you think of like what written language has done, you know, for humanity, you know, like the fact that it can be accumulated. So, I mean, I was just thinking a lot about only accumulation, and color was, in these works, were secondary. The color was just a differentiation between layers. So for me, here I would just make sure that the one color was different from the other color, just so you can see the complexity. And I was more interested in doing these like very complex objects that sort of grew and, you know, were in between painting and sculpture. I mean, I think here they were very much in that in between, you know, these two ideas, because they were very object-like, very, you know, like they just had this very material presence. So this was this work. But then with some of that material, when I try to cut it bigger, it was just very, very hard technically. So I sort of put it aside until I could build a machine. And then, you know, in that time, I was working on other projects. I did sculptures, I did, you know, installations. I did, you know, at some point I opened a gallery with 2 other artists. We did, I had 2 kids. It was, you know, life sort of took, you know, some time for me to make this machine. And then when I came back to the material, I started to, you know, I had the machine made. I started cutting years worth of blocks that I had accumulated, I had never been able to see. And then I started to separate the different, because the strip is very big. But in between, I had like different palettes that I had tested as I was, you know, sometimes I was putting one color next to the other as a differentiation, but I was also thinking of painting and the history of painting. And so I was trying all these like color theory ideas in these like smaller palettes, you know, and all this paint was found. So I would go to like a dumpster and pick it up. And so the palettes were pretty much what I could find. So then I started to just separate out these layers and, you know, put them together. So these works were made with, you know, that old material sort of rethought, and like, you know, I was sort of looking at it through, you know, a much more mature lens of like what I had been doing. You know, I had done a lot of other paintings, and so with this also, when I was thinking of accumulations, I was also thinking of like history as this very long resource for making work. So for example, here I was looking at the gesture on different Peter Paul Rubens paintings, which have this like amazing gestural, you know, like their torsos and the figures. So since I only had line and color to work with, I was looking at gesture as a way of you know, bringing that line to become something else, you know, so not necessarily going into specific form, but the line was suggestive of a certain type of, you know, form or gesture. In this one, I was thinking of contrapposto and, you know, different types of, you know, Greek and Roman sculpture, and the way just simple movement and the way that you place the weight somewhere just completely changes the way you think of something. I don't know if you want to add anything about this.
In order to understand your process of the development of your research, I would say, yeah, these have these references to other moments of art. This in particular has some sort of rippling look to it, but it's all mostly about the stacking itself. Either whatever it does, it's not so much about color as it would become here. So I guess you're working through an idea of a structure that is quite pliant, you know, malleable and flexible, and you are sort of asking about what structure is or means, or, you know, in terms of painting, but it's still color. It's not here as a strong factor. But then you turn to color, and then because you're asking about the structure, then you will have, you get to this point in which you have to question what is the structuring capacity of color itself, how to integrate this type of configuration with color's behavior, right? And so it begins to be that idea of constructed color, but also not only constructed, but constructive, how color becomes an agent in the construction of the work, how it partakes of the structure itself. So this as a way of introduction to your research on color theory, which is a system for rationalizing the behavior of color, and how you deal with that and what implications that might have for other questions that you have raised that we will talk about, which we will talk a little bit later.
Yeah, so I'll get into color now. So some of these older paintings I was thinking of in terms of when I would find certain palettes, I would start to try it out. So if you see here, these are primary colors and secondary colors. So this is a small sketch that I did later on when I was sort of revisiting this old material and these old ideas. So that's pretty much a sketch of what this would be. But as you see, it's like a completely different thing. I mean, one is this very like rational, just lines and one thing after the other. This one, I like to think, there's a huge difference between when you plan something and the reality of something, like between the, something, well, and I also like to make it in a way that's very imperfect and just, not too controlled, because I really like what happens, when, there's more paint on one side than the other, so you start to get these waves, and so then you start to think about gravity, the way that, maybe the thing was tilted and more paint got on one side, on the other side. So then on this flat plane, you start getting all these forces that are outside of, what you would think of painting. You start to bring in things that just kind of contradict each other in the way that they function. So from discovering these ideas in the older work, then I kept having more and more questions about color. I mean, especially the idea of perception and the way that, perception is something that's not, is shared between cultures and is something that is very general. So to me, that became really interesting, the way that, color became a way of accessing perception and accessing, like this more like phenomenological way of looking at things, rather than like symbolic or, or it's just not specific. It's like a very open way of thinking. That's a detail of that same piece. This is another one with primaries and secondaries, but I had found light colors, so I had put them together. So it's a very different painting, even though it's pretty much the same idea as this. It's just a matter of the value, and also these were with colors that were not pure. So here I was using muted colors. So there's a few of them there. And then for this show, it's the first time that I actually went for pure color. It's the first time that I wanted to see what happened if I control the color more. Instead of working with found material, I was, buying exactly the colors that I wanted, and I wanted to see, what happened. I had all these questions about, essentially, things that I wanted to see, like what would happen if, so I had all these ideas that I had been collecting from this older work that sort of translated into this body of work. Like the one on the far left is the sketch for the piece behind us. This third one is the sketch for that piece. So you can see, they're very different than the actual, I mean, this just serves very much as, okay, this idea, now I'm gonna apply it and construct it and, build.
So these are like very tentative ideas because they do not translate all that is going to happen in the work. This is sort of a rational perhaps template that is going to be reprogrammed by the work itself into something much more physical. So you have where you have told me about, you want to create this tension between the rational and the natural. So these are not prescriptions for a definite outcome, because that outcome is always deviate from this program. So in some way you have a program, but you proceed unprogrammatically. You proceed to disrupt that program in the same way that these pictures have an organization that would seem to be very regular and serial, but that seriality is always disrupted. So you have this, I would say, this tendency to present that tension as something to explore, and in this sense, I also have noticed that you told me once that you hate the term op art. Why?
Well, because it sounds like a gimmick, Like, I'm not looking for something for your eyes to, to have, like you say op art and I think of like Vasarely and this sort of like, aesthetic that looks like 80s computer graphics, or, it just has this connotation that it sort of simplifies what I'm trying to do, because it's not about the optical effect, but I'm using what I know is going to happen with the optical effect to create something else. It's not about the optical effect. It's about what you can do with with that effect. So to call it op art is just a simplification. It sounds gimmicky, and
certainly it's not op art. It is optical, but not op art. But also there are other differences that I think are worth remarking upon. For instance, Vasarely, in the Vasarely work, when you get the optical impression, the system is sort of not operative anymore. What you get is impression. So the rationality of the work is there. It prescribes an outcome, a very defined outcome, but there is that tension between production and perception that one can find in your work. And this relates to some things that also are important to you. They have to do with the idea of anti-form, as presented by Robert Morris in a text that he published in Artforum in 1967. It has to do with this idea of a prescribed order imposed on the materiality of the works, on the materials. Could you turn to the... Oh, you want to say more?
Well, that's okay. I mean, these are some of the sketches. Like, for example, this one's all the way in the front. So you just wanted to get to, that's just a few examples. But yeah, I mean, Robert Morris for me is, very influential.
See, what I was trying to say is that your preparatory drawings are not prescriptive. They do not impose an order on the events that are going to take place once you confront the work, because these works are open to random. I mean, the configurations, because of the latex, of the breaks in the latex does not allow you to sort of control throughout what is going to happen. And somehow that you're relinquishing part of the control to the material itself, to the fluidity, the liquidity of the material. And that connects quite straightforwardly with what Robert Morris was arguing against minimalism when he was sort of saying that in minimalism you have an imposed order on the materials. You have a prescribed logic that regulates how even though it's very simple, one element next to the other, that organization doesn't come out of the material. It doesn't emanate from the materiality, from the physicality of the material. And what he wanted us to do was to oppose that in works whose configurations would sort of be the effect of the material, of the physicality of the material used, as in this case, the felt pieces, which this is how these works are known, in which felt is allowed to behave according to its own properties, physical properties. According to gravity, to tumble down and take on forms and configurations which are not and cannot be controlled or prescribed. Well, that's the argument, and I think this is one of the most successful works by Morris along those lines. So, but perhaps you could expound more why this text has been so formative for you.
He talks about things that sort of make themselves, like it's something that reveals the making of itself. I mean, Morris also did a box with the sound of his own making. So he had a cube that he built, but he recorded, while he was building the cube. So when you see the piece, it's a cube, but you hear, his whole process of actually making the thing. So for me, the way he thought of art that sort of make itself depending on the materiality, for me, it's very important. And I agree with him a lot with like his critique of minimalism, with like this idea of like seriality or unity, that minimalism sort of carried, that I find seriality boring, and I find, this sort of like containment also like unnecessary. I want my works to, instead of contain, I want them to expand, because I think when you see my work, you don't see it all at once. You have to sort of experience it. You have to either get close and go back. So there's no one reading of the work, whereas a lot of minimalism, once you see it, you see a form and you know what the form is and what it does, and you sort of grasp it, So in a way, I like also his critique of that, where that was coming from. Even though there are other things in minimalism that I find interesting, like, the idea of like theatricality, where it's this sort of performance of the viewer and the work. So I think that's a moment where that, it's important, which is, it's also shared by a lot of the neo-concrete artists. I think you mentioned that in the text, this idea of the engagement with the work is what creates the work. So that from minimalism, it's like, I'm not for or against, but, for the most part, it's like, okay, this is something that I appreciate, that I learned from.
Morris himself did minimalist works before this, and now the question is not for or against minimalism. It's about the argument, this idea of anti-form. And now that you mentioned the box with the sound of its own making, that relates to something else in your work, which is the contraction of different temporalities. Because when you see the box, Morris's box, you see a very clean wood cube present in front of you, already made, and you just perceive it and grasp it as something that is there, present, in your perceptual presence or present. But with the sound, that makes you to backtrack to that past of the making of the work, and that past making and the present work sort of come together in sort of in some sort of contraction that is quite interesting. To me, it's interesting because that's what I see when I see the work, your work. It is the presence of color, of the event, of the mixing of hues, or of these sort of phenomenological field that opens up in front of me, which is this presence of my viewing, I'm right in front, but at the same time, I have to confront the process, the production, and that sort of makes me go back to all these. I have to examine it and somehow to try to reconstruct it because it presents questions to me as a viewer. I don't know if that's the experience of every viewer, but I think that's something that this contraction between two times, the making and the seeing, is quite important. And you want to add something?
I completely agree. I mean, I want the making to be visible, to be, transparent. The same way that the labor in Locust Projects was visible, here the labor that I made for this work is also visible and present. So, that's definitely.
And it comes to disrupt whatever up artsiness you may find there, because in up art you don't get that. You don't get that.
It's all effect and no process.
Yeah. Okay. So once now that we have that sort of, let's shift to Latin American abstraction, but an example that relates to Morris, which is an example of Gego, who created this sort of an environmental installation in 1969 in Caracas. And she is working not so much against form itself as Morris, but against its structure and quite specifically architectonic structures. So she's making this reference to architecture, but only to undo architecture. She's striking against, opposing architectonic rationality, the idea of a well-built construction that is logical and in which all the parts come together because of a plan. And that's one thing. On the other, there's this use of line that takes on a physicality, strong physicality. Line is displaced into space and becomes a vector for the construction of a space. So that's one other thing. And the other thing is the module that she's using. She's using sort of one specific unit, like a triangle, and she's deforming that modularity. She's extending and making it more flexible. So she's using modularity, but again, to upend the idea of repetition, of seriality, and of logic, of constructive logic. So I think, of course, there are many. You have told me that you see somehow it resonates with what you have been trying to or succeeding in doing.
Yeah, I think like that logic of the triangle as this one unit. It, in a way, functions as like. It's like, okay, I'm doing a primary color, so it's like red, yellow, and blue, right? And from there it grows into something that's bigger than the sum of its parts. So it's starting from this like one idea that sort of grows and mutates as it goes and as it grows. So in Gego's work, I find a lot of that like resisting rationality and sort of letting things play out. I also like the way she challenges the different categories. So this is not necessarily a sculpture, but it's there are also drawings in space. So I think that she has this very this is
Drawn without paper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the way she just challenges like these notions of traditional mediums and media, because these in a way are objects, right? So they're presented as flat and painterly, but they're very much in between because they really are a sliced object. So in Gego, I find a lot of similarities in the process and in the ideas. And she was also, at that time, a lot of the work being produced in Venezuela, even though it's, amazing, it's also it was very like of the moment of modernism and, you know, rationality and perfection and lines and, you know, industrial materials in a, you know, in a certain way. So I think she was resisting that, you know, which I sort of find myself doing that as well when I'm tackling color, you know, which is such a, you know, you think so much of all the Venezuelan artists when you're dealing with color. But I definitely don't want to do what they did, you know. I want to sort of take these ideas and present them, you know, in what interests me and, you know, what, you know, using my own ideas, essentially.
And now let's turn to some other reference that you.
Yeah. So this is Jack Whitten, a work by Jack Whitten. So yeah, I mean, being in Miami, it's like you're in the middle of these two, you know, sort of. This is like the limbo space between Latin America and, you know, the rest of the United States and, you know, a little bit of Europe. So yeah, my work is definitely influenced by, you know, things from there, from here, from, you know, from yeah. And Whitten is somebody who I, you know, discovered recently, only a few years ago. So, you know, I don't know that he has influenced the way that I made these, but the more I read about him, the more I'm interested in his work and his ideas and the way that his ideas have been sort of written about. And, you know, he made a...
Can you explain how this was made?
Sure. So these, for these, he would create like a big squeegee, and he had a platform. So he would set up sort of like the situation, and then he would just carry it out in one action. So, you know, the idea that he was sort of making his own tools and his own process, you know, I think relates a lot to the way that I'm working. Also the idea of time, I mean, for him, it was about speeding up the gesture. He was a student of de Kooning, so he said, like, you know, it's like, okay, the only way to beat de Kooning is to be faster than him. So how can I be faster than de Kooning? How can I just make things in one gesture? And he was also thinking of the photographic process, because he would say that he was developing these. So he was connecting a lot of different ideas that were, you know, to me are very interesting. So this is just like this single gesture that takes him away from this sort of like abstract expressionism into this different sort of making a painting rather than painting a painting, which are also ideas that I'm very interested about. And he also talked a lot about DNA in his work, and I constantly think of DNA. And DNA, you know, it's a code. So it's you know, DNA could be also the digital world, which is also code base or language. So there are many things, or, you know, these codes that generate things outside of themselves. So Whitten would also think of DNA a lot and incorporate these ideas of, like, you know, codified experience and, you know, like thinking of codes in different ways. So for me, you know, I've been reading a lot about Jack Whitten lately. I mean, he's been one of my latest, like, obsessions and, you know, what I've been reading about.
Talking about codes, and then you get to these later works in which you begin to you insert like dry morsels of paint into the latex while it is still the process of getting dry. And then these insertions create disruptions, and you are trying sort of, you're trying to make sort of signs or some sort of inscriptions that you relate to language, the way one to an alphabet, perhaps, the sort of the signs of an alphabet or marks that might be read in connection to that. Somehow, this is another way of coding the work, sort of as introducing these marks that then you would have to perhaps try to decipher, being that there are marks that you connect to language, but, you know, of course, that deciphering is not going to release any cohesive meaning, but the idea of making the material release that meaning is what I think is quite important. And I'm talking specifically of this work, which I think is magnificent. This idea that some marks are made there, that they sort of might be grasped as signs, but at the same time they are so material that any significance is disrupted. But that takes you back to with more force to the idea of the concrete expressivity of the material, how the material itself may release meaning that cannot be compared to the way language produces meaning. And then you have again this connection between language as a rational process of generating meaning and the materiality, the material's significance, which sort of proceeds according to other conditions, and it's completely all the time disrupting in your work the cohesion of meaning. So
yeah, this painting for me is very important, and I'm actually working on, like, sort of what I understood from this one. I'm sort of bringing it to other pieces. I think first this is a primary color work, so it's only red, yellow, and blue, which are sort of like building blocks, the same way that separate letters work as building blocks for something else. But I also think a lot about the idea of primary experience, which is what you experience, physically, and mediated experience, which, language is mediated experience, images are mediated experience. So I wanted to put these two ideas in tension, this idea of like language and experience, and see what happened. And to me, it's really interesting that, this is almost like a generative painting, because it's made from the building blocks of color, which is primary colors, and also from these building blocks of language. Now I'm adding more language. I want it to be even more noticeable. When I first did it, I was still like, didn't understand how much you were gonna see. I mean, I don't wanna have just like letters, in it, but I definitely want that idea of like coding and, this sort of, and also thinking of language not as like single letters, but as like the web of what they create when they come together. So in a way, this painting is...
So you're getting back to this idea of historical accumulation that you were exploring at first in your sort of Baroque or Greek patterns. You were saying that you were thinking about the condensation of different layers of history, perhaps. So layering becomes not only a way of constructing the work, but it becomes a concept itself in your process that you are sort of refining or redefining. And one thing that you mentioned about this type of works is that there is a different pattern that begins to emerge. So I see that, I find that interesting because, when I wrote about your work, I was emphasizing this, the stacking, and I was relating that to archiving and the process of archiving as something that generates knowledge about color, for instance. But that pattern of the stacking, the regular stacking, which is never regular, now there is something else, another pattern that begins to emerge, but comes into tension with this, the first one. So it's like you were sort of trying to explore a way beyond these paintings, beyond perhaps of painting itself, because you are trying to make painting refer to a set of contexts that are also layered, like reference to history, reference to other spaces, other modes of making. So I don't know. You perhaps you can elaborate, but you know where.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think with the first works, I was thinking of, first painting is such a, like historical sort of medium. I mean, it carries so much history. So I like that those paintings were both relating to the history of painting and to the history of their own making. So there was this historical, thing that happened in like different registers. And now I'm, sort of thinking about them. It's even, how do you say it? you know, I have this pattern that's, you know, a little more certain, but the interruptions, it's almost like mutations in DNA, you know, it's where, in the interruptions is where there's the possibilities of things happening. You know, so you sort of have this thing that acts as it's almost like a screen or a raster, you know, where you have this you know, it's like a wholeness to it, but in the interruptions is where it suggests, you know, all these other things that could just be generated by the process itself. So in a way, you know, it's almost like paintings that create themselves. So I'm interested in that sort of, you know, idea. And same with the one all the way in the back. That's a full spectrum. You know, so thinking of light as, you know, light is what makes us see, essentially, you know, without light we don't see. So kind of what happens if I make light material, right? Like if I make this sort of idea of color translate into light, and then what happens if I can, you know, like not only color be material, but also light? Like can I create this thing that emits light, that it, you know, that gives this idea of sort of playing with light, playing with like almost with the fabric of reality in a way, you know? So I'm making also some works like that, thinking of, you know, these ideas, taking them further. A little bit like, so this is half, you know, half spectrum. It's not the full spectrum, but, you know, once you insert these things in the painting, then, you know, something else starts to happen. And there's still, I mean, here the forms look a little more defined because it's a photo, but when you see it in person, the forms are not so defined. They feel more like pulsating, or, you know, they sort of like things that go back and forth. Small detail there.
So if you think about code, it's also the crumbling of the code. It's code that begins sort of to have this sort of weird behavior and stops acting as such. And if you think about it as a raster, it's a screen that's like the screen that collapses as a screen that begins to sort of behave in a logical way. I don't know if that resonates. This idea of, you're talking about not this irrational construction, but you are trying to disrupt that rationality. But also I was thinking about the scale of the works here, how that sort of connects to other, perhaps because what I'm trying to get at is to see what you think about the contemporary import of how you see painting in our times, and how this may relate, since we're talking about temporalities and accumulation of historical references, how this scrambling of different historical and symbolic and constructive layers might sort of open up other contexts for painting, not so bound within, you know, the framed boundaries of the painting itself. Other perhaps contexts of production of labor, since labor has been so basic to your whole project. Making labor visible is one of the conditions of your work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in terms of scale, I think it's important, you know, for, you know, what we were talking about, the perception of the viewer and the engagement of the viewer. You know, once you have a certain scale, then it's a different experience than a smaller scale. You know, things at a smaller scale might look more like, you know, like jewels, or, you know, like it's a different experience of painting. So, I mean, I'm definitely thinking of, you know, like somebody like Rothko, or, you know, like, you know, historical painting where the scale was important in the production. But I also think of scale here that it's, you know, the piece could be very big, but there's also this very micro scale that this process allows me to do. So, you know, you have this very large work, but it also has this very fine, you know, where you can get this close to the piece and still see differentiation within it. So it almost makes the object larger because it's almost like it has more resolution. You know, you see it and it's, you know, you can get inside of the object in a way, you know, visually. And there's also a shift in scale from this very massive to this very close that, you know, and the piece is completely different from one view than the other view. So that's very important to me as well, that, you know, we're in a time where like images dominate, you know, images, language, I mean, anything that's certain, it's very dominant in our culture, you know. So I find that it's very interesting to make something that resists that. You know, like these are, when you photograph them, it's not the piece. I mean, it's just one interpretation of the piece at that time from that perspective. So to me, it's very important that you have to engage with these, that they're very different from one way to the other, that they don't form a specific image, you know. So in a way that we were talking about Murray's anti-form, I think of these as anti-image.
Yeah, because we're talking about the resistance to the image. You always mention that.
Yeah.
So could you?
Well, I mean, images contain, you know, images are essentially they're lies. I mean, they're like, you know, same way as symbols, you know, symbols contain things in a, you know, smaller package so you can get maybe, you know, it communicates better, but it doesn't communicate itself, you know. So for me, these have this, you know, they instead of containing, they're sort of open. They reveal themselves as you approach them. They change as you view them. So I think that's very important for painting because, I mean, ever since the invention of photography, painting has had to compete with other ways of making images, right? And, you know, we're in a time where there's so many ways and so much, you know, you can just make an image out of anything, and you see them, you know, in your phones and in the highway, you know, so the image has become so present that to me it's important to find this place in painting where, you know, that painting can do something completely different from images, you know. You can make paintings that just do something else. They almost exist in a different, you know, place, you know.
Okay, why don't we see if there's some questions here?
Yeah.
This was one block before you sliced it, this painting?
Yeah.
How thick was it?
The thickness, well, it was actually thicker, but I separated a strip, so it was 1.5 inches, and now it's like 1 inch.
No, I'm saying the whole block before you sliced it.
Yeah, it was about 1.5 inch by 72 by like 10 inches wide. Yeah.
Thank you both for this discussion. It was awesome. I've worked alongside of this guy for a number of years, so I've watched the evolution of thinking happen. And I'm the documenter, so
Yeah.
we always have very good debates in the studio on images and making, and I feel like I just kind of wanted to reiterate a point that he already made. But I thought when we were in the studio, you said the same thing. How do you create something that lives on multiple sort of existence or planes at the same time? Almost like when you interact with a human, you have perception, you have emotion, all of these sort of encounters at the same time. And from documenting art, not a lot of art does that. It doesn't, for me, it doesn't engage me on, like you said, when you move far away, it becomes a color palette. When you come close, it starts to become like a scientific investigation. And I feel like, exactly what you said, the debate between painting and photography and making things ready-made, I think you have achieved that. And I feel like getting to work with you and watching this process happen, it's nice for me to watch a scientist sort of nail his hypothesis, you know? So, excellent.
Yeah, thank you, Zach.
Anyone else?
I
I just want to thank everyone, and I just want to say that the way that Mr. Ledesma puts this notion of the archival facts, it resonates with me deeply because I'm interested in how you employ a lot of these technological, this machine that you use in your work, which allows insight into ourselves as a way to kind of analyze the world and reality to some extent. So I'm interested in knowing, like, how did you come to discover this sort of machine slicing the latex paint? It's such an interesting kind of scope and angle as a way to kind of build painting.
Yeah, the machine came later as I try to move up in scale. At first, it was, I mean, I literally started accumulating paint like in high school, you know, because I used to make regular paintings, and I was more interested. At some point, I realized I was more interested about the palette that I used to mix the colors that I never cleaned, and it would grow, and that became more interesting to me than the paintings that I was trying to make on the canvas. So at some point, you know, years later in college, I'm like, you know, if I slice this palette, it's going to have a register of every painting that I've made so far. And that idea was just so much more interesting than, like, you know, trying to make paintings, you know, the paintings that I was making. So at first I was just cutting them with, you know, a knife, and I used to keep more of the block and make like chunkier and bigger objects. But I thought it was interesting to bring them to this like more flat and painterly, because I think the object, it's already visible. I find this format just has more tension between what you would expect from a painting and what you would expect from a sculpture. So it's more of this in-between state. So I think tension is important for, you know, in I don't know, at least for me, for making my paintings. So, yeah.
That time for one more.
Quick question. There have been times in the past where you mentioned that you're more interested in paint as the object than paint as the illusion. And I feel like now you have started to incorporate the illusion in the physical formation of the paint. So I'm curious of just sort of how you started to bring that into it rather than just like the object, right?
Yeah, I think the illusion just happens on its own. I mean, and I don't know, illusion is a weird word, you know, but I mean, I think, so at first I was more interested in just the process, but I want to see what happens, you know, like when more things start to occur in this. And it doesn't mean that, like, you know, maybe I'll make some of these works and decide to, you know, not continue, you know, I mean, I'm not attached to, but I feel now I want to explore more like what happens in this sort of like structuring of, you know, of the work. And now that I'm making these new molds, I'm literally making sculptures and, you know, out of paint and putting them inside and then having this sort of geological process, like, you know, consume them. And then, you know, it's all from, you know, sculpture to flat to sculpture, you know, so I don't know, I'm very interested in all these translations of, you know, how these things start as this object and then how they get translated as this like slicing. So I'm not trying to create more illusions, I'm trying to create more, I guess, connections, or, you know, maybe have even more ideas inside of each work. So trying to make these paintings are already complex, making them even more complex. I mean, I love extremes, you know, I love to find where's the limit of this, you know. Yeah, so it's almost like instead of the conversation of the death of painting, I think that was always misinterpreted as like people trying to push painting to limits, you know. So I like to think of, you know, I like to think of the death of painting, but I see it more as like just how much can you push, you know, the limit, you know, and that's